Welcome to the Green Urbanist podcast, where we explore sustainable placemaking, climate action in cities, and urban rewilding. I'm your host, Ross O'Kelly, an urban designer, educator, and sustainable placemaking consultant. Hello, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're talking about climate communication or communicating sustainability, and I have some advice for how to do that effectively. I ran a poll via my newsletter recently, and I asked people to tell me what are the skills and the knowledge areas that they want to develop that will help them in their careers, basically. And one of the things that came out was people are very interested in improving their communication skills, getting some advice about how to communicate more effectively. And I agree, this is a absolutely essential skill in in any profession, but particularly if you're working in sustainability, if you're passionate about it and you're trying to push for change within your sector, within your job, communicating effectively is absolutely essential for that. Luckily, this is basically what I do. I'm a communicator, so I have some advice that I have learned over the years that I'd like to share with you. So I really have 4 points today, 4 bits of advice that you can sort of take away and think about what that means for your particular communication context, your communication needs. I'll try and keep this fairly punchy, fairly concise. The first tip that I have, the first bit of advice is when you are thinking about what you're going to be communicating and who your audience is, you need to start with empathy. So you need to start by thinking about who your audience is, what are the points that you need to communicate, and tailor your narrative and your approach to communication to that audience. So it's tempting to have like a standard PowerPoint presentation or have a standard, set of graphics or standard speech that you use no matter what the situation is. And you might feel like, well, I know the science, I know my stuff, I'll just roll that out, no matter who I'm speaking to. But I think this is a mistake because everyone comes into these situations with their own preconceptions, their own level of understanding, their own level of education on these topics, but also our own lens for viewing the world, and different things have different levels of importance for different people. So if you're, for instance, speaking to a client like a property developer or a funder or an investor, they would have you would take a very different approach to communicating with them about climate change and sustainability compared to if you were speaking to, say, local politicians or to local residents. These are 3 very, very different groups. So I'll get into this episode a bit more strategies or tactics for how you might communicate with these different groups, depending on what your audience is. The second point I want to make, and the second bit of advice, is around narrative, and it's about finding the opportunity in the crisis. For a long time, communication around sustainability has been very negative focused. It's been really forefronting negativity in terms of what climate change means, the impacts that will have, the impacts it is having, and it's a real doom and gloom narrative. I think what we've seen is that is effective for some groups, but not for others. And for the average person, I would say, that sort of narrative has become very played out, and there is a risk that we've talked in those sort of negative terms so much over the last 10 years that really people become a bit numb to it. And they switch off immediately when they hear, how many people will be displaced by climate change, how many people will die, these really, really hard numbers, which are true and are based in science. But, is that in your situation the most effective way to communicate with people? That is the question. And I think what we've seen and what's been borne out in research is that leading with a positive narrative is much more effective in terms of actually motivating people towards action. Negative narratives can shock people and can help to change their mind, but it doesn't necessarily, push them into action. And often there isn't necessarily a clear path to action in those negative narratives. So finding the opportunity in the crisis. Climate change is pushing a rapid transformation of society. This can be scary for people, but a key narrative that we can work with is that it's an opportunity to make rapid progress on environmental and social and economic challenges that we would want to make progress on anyway. it's an opportunity, for our context, it's an opportunity to improve our cities, to improve our lifestyles, and to address things like the cost of living crisis. And so it depends what you're looking at. If you're designing a building, or you're looking at a master plan, or you're looking at policy, you'll figure out what is an effective positive narrative to take here. But I think we need to get away from this idea that sustainability is something that we're only doing to avoid catastrophe, or that we're just doing as a technical exercise that isn't really relevant to people's lives. That's sort of happening in the background, and it's to do with heat pumps and solar panels, and people won't really, doesn't really matter for people's day-to-day life. It really does matter, and we can have a lot of positivity and a lot of make a lot of benefits for people's lives through the work that we do. And so an example of this would be the rewilding narrative. So broadly, rewilding has become a really mainstream concept, and part of the reason for its success and the fact that there's now huge landscapes across the world that are being rewilded or taking a rewilding approach, whereas for decades a more nature conservation approach hasn't been as effective at galvanizing public support and excitement, is because it's a positive and a hopeful narrative that nature, which is degraded, can be recovered, and that we can share the benefits of all of that in terms of having wild animals living near us, having contact with nature, having and the fact that it's also climate action, and it can have carbon sequestration benefits, that can have climate adaptation benefits, is almost secondary to the really kind of tangible, positive, hopeful narrative of rewilding. So that's something to learn from. Maybe you're not doing something in the ecology field, but this idea of actually showing people a vision for the future that can be much richer and much more alive, rather than just mitigating disaster, seems to be really effective. More specifically, within the built environment sector, a narrative that is emerging similar to that is really based on more positivity and more hope, is regenerative design, as opposed to the traditional sustainability narrative. So sustainability typically is about reducing harm, reducing our impact, treading lightly on the earth. But regenerative design takes it a step further and is really about creating as much positive impact on society and on the environment and on nature as we possibly can with our particular projects and whatever we're working on. And so I think that's why regenerative design, although some people may feel it's just a new buzzword and, what does it really mean? There isn't really an agreed definition of it. It is starting to become more mainstream, and is, I've heard from practitioners who are really doubling down on the regenerative narrative that it's been really effective at motivating people to do better work, to really invest in this sort of positive narrative and to doing things beyond the status quo. The final point on this, creating a positive narrative point, is that I think we have to be careful not to pander to ideas of economic growth and green growth, because I think that can be quite dangerous. This idea that we can continue to have, huge amounts of economic growth on a finite planet with finite resources by simply switching to renewable technology. I mean, I think that's a narrative that works for a particular group, but I just don't think it's necessarily true in terms of the science and just in terms of basic physics. So I think we need to be careful with, overreaching a little bit with some of these things of saying we can keep having lots of economic growth, your business can keep returning more profits every year. You just need to, transition away from oil and gas into renewable energy. We need to be careful with that. However, when we're speaking to businesses, to investors, I think there's a certain aspect of speaking to the inevitability of the transition and the competition around sustainability. And so certainly within the built environment sector, at least in the context I'm working in, Europe and the UK, there is now a lot of competition in terms of having sustainability as a driving force behind a project is seen as an extra selling point. It's seen as something that is very good for like a brand reputation, a developer's reputation. It's seen as something that can differentiate your office building or your residential development from the competition. And so I think speaking to that and doing a little bit of market research and saying, well, the use of sort of other competitors, other developments that are happening are really, being quite good on sustainability or circular economy or whatever it is. It's really important that we don't fall behind. And sort of using that as a bit of a narrative to say, actually, it makes a lot of business sense to do these things. You don't have to appeal to people's, morals all the time. Sometimes that doesn't work for particular groups. And so making the case that actually, degenerative business models are very much on the way out. And I do believe that. And so, it makes business sense for people to switch over to more sustainable and more regenerative ways of approaching these things, even if it's sort of imperfect in the transition. I think making progress in that way can be effective. My third point, which I think is quite actually tied to the positive narrative point, the third point is make it relevant and tangible for people. So we often talk about climate change in quite abstract ways around things like degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels. And even if you carefully explain the science, it often doesn't hit home for people. I understand the science and I read and I engage with, research around climate science, but actually it doesn't hit home emotionally until I start to see how it is tangible and relevant to my life and to people's lives. And so that's a really important part of communicating, is don't get hung up with the scientific graphs and the degrees of warming. I think if you think if you think the audience needs to have a bit of that scientific background, as some people do, you can include that. But then you need to go straight away into what it means for them, for their local communities, for their business, and put it into tangible terms that they can say, I've never thought about it that way, or, I can really see what that will be like, and that can then motivate people into action. And so something that I've had some success with is using a city analogues approach. So there was a research paper by Baston et al. That came out in 2019, which looked at a huge list of world cities. And they quantified, based on a particular climate scenario, by 2050, which existing city will this city be like in terms of how its climate will change. And so, for instance, they have estimated that London in 2050, which is only 25 years away, will be more similar to Barcelona's current climate than to London's current climate. And there's I'll link to the paper. I'm not sure if it's behind a paywall, but you should be able to get some of the information out of it anyway. And it tells you a bunch of big cities in the world, how their climate will change, and it gives you an existing city to use as a reference point. And so I found that to be really, really effective, because if you tell people we're expecting X many more days of temperatures above 30 degrees, and if we're expecting more chance of heat wave, more chance of flooding, people kind of get it, but it doesn't feel very tangible. It doesn't feel very real. But if you say, okay, have you been to Barcelona? You've been there during the summer and it's incredibly hot and dry, and sometimes they have trouble with droughts already. That's very similar to what London will be like in 25 or 30 years. And London's culture and infrastructure and buildings are not, weren't designed for that. They're not prepared for it. And so that gives you a sense of the scale of the challenge when it comes to adapting to climate change and the need to mitigate climate change very, very quickly. And I found that people latch onto that, and it gives them a hook, and it gives them something to talk about with other people as well. And they can say, did you know London is going to be like Barcelona in 30 years? So that can be quite effective. And you can do a bit of research and find for your local area, for your local city, what that hook might be. Then moving on to sort of action, I think it's not always that mitigating climate change or adapting to climate change is actually compelling for people. I know it sounds kind of crazy, but for some people, they just don't, it doesn't really hit home for them, even when you use sort of approaches like the city analogues approach. For them, it's much more about their day-to-day concerns. And I think that's absolutely fine. We don't have to convert everyone into an environmentalist. We can, the great thing about sustainability is that it is really about improving people's lives and improving lifestyles, not just about, bringing the numbers of carbon dioxide down. And so we can speak to things like cost of living, quality of life, health, people's day-to-day experience of their lives as a way of showing them why taking sustainability measures is actually something they would be interested in doing. So a classic example is, we'll say, passive house or passive design approach in architecture. It's a great way of reducing the operational energy and therefore the emissions associated with a building. Most people don't care about that. What they care about is the fact that they never have to turn their heating on, and they have, their heating bill has massively reduced, and they're saving hundreds of pounds or hundreds of euros a year, even in cold climates. And so these are the kind of hooks that we can use to say, actually, this is going to be a really immediate and tangible benefit for your quality of life, for your health, saving you money, and the fact that it's a more sustainable option is sort of secondary. Let us worry about that. People just we just need people to sort of see the benefits for them doing this. I had an interesting conversation recently with Scott Macaulay, and Scott he's a regenerative design specialist within an architecture company. But he told me, working with clients, he finds talking about circular economy and opening with circular economy is kind of a gateway concept into broader sustainability and regenerative design discussions. And so circular economy for an architectural project might mean making use of materials that are already on site, making use of materials that are within your local area that are already existing. And it's a very tangible sort of idea for people who are used to working with, the nuts and bolts of making a development happen. And he said he's found that people in the development industry really like the idea of this because it's something they can grab onto and something they can start to explore straight away. And then that opens up opportunities to talk about decarbonisation or other sort of social impacts associated with that. So again, making it relevant and tangible for people. It doesn't mean everyone has to understand the big picture the way you do. Sometimes it just means finding something that people will get motivated and excited about and using that as a way in to start building trust, start building momentum, and inevitably, push things in a more sustainable direction. The final point I want to make is called Don't Preach, Co-Create and Explore Solutions Together. It's very, very tempting for us who are well versed in sustainability and climate science to feel like it's our mission to go out and convince people to that this is important and that they need to take action, and here are the actions you need to take because science says so and we understand this and this is fact. Again, that doesn't really play very well with people a lot of the time. So forcing that information, onto people doesn't tend to work and can actually cause backlash because people don't like being talked down to. People don't like to be told how they're supposed to live their life or how their place is supposed to be. And so I think something that's much more effective, it takes a bit more time, but it's well worth the time investment, is a co-creation and a facilitation process. And so we'll say with a local community, this might mean starting a project with a workshop with members of the local community, with residents, and going on a bit of a learning journey with them and using tools and processes and a framework to sort of guide them through an understanding of climate change, how it will impact their local area, and figuring out together that they can have, an equal contribution to the discussion, what a response might be in terms of taking action in their area. And then you as the expert are there more to feed in ideas, tell them about case studies and examples and what's possible and what's not possible, during that process, rather than like front loading it with a load of information and sort of, beating people over the head with PowerPoint slides. So there's one tool that I've used in the past, which I think is quite effective, is called the En-ROADS Climate Simulator. That is spelled EN-ROADS Climate Simulator. I'll put a link in the episode description. And that is a sort of global climate simulator. It's a systems model. It has, like a lot of mathematics and algorithms in the background, but it gives you a really simple interface in your web browser that you can go in and you can simulate global climate action and see what effect that will have on global emissions and degrees of warming by the end of the century. And so if you wanted to have a very big sort of global discussion with people as a learning exercise, that can be quite useful because basically inevitably the result of going through that process is there's no silver bullet, there's no easy answers. We have to do a whole range of things. We have to get off fossil fuels. We have to electrify transport and heating. We have to stop deforestation. We have to, address methane. So everything has to be addressed at all scales, all at the same time. And so it kind of just shows people that change is possible. There's a lot that can be done. And within this, big world of climate action, we can find what our local thing is that we're going to do and see how that clicks in and locks in with the bigger puzzle of global climate action. That won't be necessary or appropriate for all audiences. If you're looking at, if you're already looking at like a very hyper-local project, maybe you don't want to start talking about the entire world. But there's other ways you can start to facilitate discussions and workshops. And this will work with clients and with other consultants and collaborators as well, to actually co-create a way forward and for you to be there as the knowledgeable sustainability person to facilitate that and to just help them with ideas, give your knowledge when it's needed, but not to be there as the person with all the answers, because often that is often people don't buy into that fully and they want to be part of that journey. And if you can get a group of people who can agree a set of solutions or set of actions together, they're much more likely to actually follow through and do it, and to be motivated to follow through and do it, than if you just wrote up a report and told them exactly what to do. So those are my 4 bits of advice for communicating climate change, communicating sustainability, whether that's with the public or with in your projects with clients and collaborators. I hope that's been useful. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I know there's lots of other points I could have included. If there's anything that you've found effective, I'd love to hear. I'll sort of add that into my, my toolbox. So feel free to get in touch via my website. There's a contact form on my website. You can also get in touch if you'd like to discuss any of your projects and see how I might be able to contribute as a facilitator or as a consultant. And you can check that out via the link in the bio. You can set up a discovery call and we can just have a chat about your project and see if I'm a good fit. That's it for now. See you in the next episode.